He was a powerful billionaire, used to fine dining, power meetings, and being in control of everything. But one ordinary dinner at a quiet restaurant changed everything, not because of the food, but because of a note slipped quietly into his hand by a waitress, a note that stopped him cold. The night had fallen heavy over the city, the skyline glowing with towers of glass and steel, but inside the restaurant everything was hushed, polished, and waiting. The billionaire CEO entered, with the same quiet dominance he carried into boardrooms, a man who lived in a world where people made way for him without being asked. The maitre d' guided him swiftly to the private section at the back, a space he always preferred, where the light was dim but the service constant, where privacy was assured, and where the quiet wealth of the room seemed to mirror his own. He was tired, though he would never admit it. The board meeting had run long, the negotiations sharp, but his face betrayed no weakness. He carried himself like a man who always won, a man who expected the world to bend. The dining room was nearly empty now. A couple in the corner whispered over wine, a lone businessman scrolled through his phone at the bar, and the faint sound of a piano played somewhere distant. For most, it was the end of an ordinary day. For him, it was another victory in an endless cycle of deals and decisions. He placed his phone on the table, its screen lighting up every few moments with emails and messages, and leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed every space belonged to him. She appeared almost silently, the waitress, moving with a practiced grace that came from years of service. She wore the uniform well, crisp and neat, with a polite smile set carefully on her face. Her voice was soft when she greeted him, but there was something beneath the surface, something not immediately visible. Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than expected, not with admiration, not with disdain, but with an intensity that seemed to say she carried a thought unspoken. He hardly noticed. To him, she was another server, part of the machinery of comfort he was used to. He ordered his meal without hesitation, steak, rare, with all the exact sides he preferred, reciting it like a ritual. She nodded, wrote nothing down, and left as quietly as she came. The CEO reached for his phone again, already immersed in messages, issuing sharp instructions into a brief call that cut through the calm of the restaurant. Even here, in a space meant for leisure, he was working, commanding, correcting. The sound of his voice carried the same authority that filled boardrooms, and though he spoke with precision and restraint, there was no mistaking the edge of power behind every word. When she returned with his wine, she placed it down gently, not interrupting his call, but her glance lingered again. This time the narrator could see it more clearly. She was hesitating, as though standing on the edge of a decision. Her smile never broke, but her eyes held a weight that seemed out of place in the polished perfection of the restaurant. She stepped back into the shadows, leaving him to sip his drink, unaware of the storm she carried within. Dinner unfolded in perfect rhythm. The appetizers arrived, plated like art, and he ate mechanically, eyes still drifting to his phone, fingers still scrolling, his mind caught between the taste of food and the hum of business. The atmosphere around him was serene, the kind of quiet that wealth can buy, but it only amplified the small details. The way her footsteps seemed to pause near his table, the way her gaze flickered to him and away, the way silence pressed between them whenever she poured his wine or set down a plate. It was not the usual invisibility of service staff, not the routine dance of diner and server. It was something different, something unspoken. When the appetizer plate was cleared, the moment arrived. It was subtle, almost invisible. As she reached for his napkin to fold it neatly, she slipped a small folded note beneath it. The motion, so practiced that no one else would have noticed. She didn't look at him then. She simply placed the silverware, smoothed the tablecloth, and walked away with her usual composure. For a moment he ignored it, assuming it was perhaps a receipt, or a mistake. He lifted his glass again, scrolling through another email, his world still circling in numbers and strategy. But curiosity has a way of breaking through even the most guarded minds. After a pause, he reached under the napkin and pulled the paper. Free. It was small, folded tightly, the kind of thing that seemed out of place in a setting like this. He unfolded it slowly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the words. The change in his face was instant. The arrogance slipped, the certainty faltered, and his hand froze halfway to his glass. Whatever was written, there was not expected, not welcome, and not something he could ignore. The man who commanded empires sat suddenly still, caught off guard in a way few had ever seen. The note lay open in his hand, its words burning louder than the quiet piano, louder than the hushed room, louder than everything else. For the first time that night, the CEO was not in control. The words on the note were few, but they cut deeper than any speech, sharper than any accusation. To anyone else they would have seemed meaningless, but to him they carried the weight of a memory he had buried long ago. Do you ever think about the factory you shut down? Do you ever think about the families you left behind? His grip on the paper tightened, his chest rising heavier with each breath. The man who spent his life outmaneuvering rivals who never flinched in front of shareholders or politicians sat frozen in his chair as the past came rushing back. The polished calm of the restaurant blurred at the edges, replaced by images of protests outside locked gates, of workers with empty hands, of decisions he had signed with the stroke of a pen that ended livelihoods in the name of survival. He had convinced himself long ago that it was just business, necessary, unavoidable. But now, here in the quiet of a nearly empty dining room, the ghost of that decision stared at him from the page. He shifted in his chair, scanning the room. The few couples nearby were lost in their own worlds. The bartender polished glasses. The piano played faintly in the background. No one looked at him, no one knew, but he knew, and there was only one person who could have slipped the note. His eyes moved toward the service station where she stood, refilling a water jug with steady hands, her expression calm, unreadable. For the first time in years, he felt paranoia crawl into his chest. How did she know? Why now? And what else did she intend to do? When she returned to his table with the main course, setting the steak down with practiced precision, he didn't wait. His voice was low, measured, but laced with steel. He asked her directly if she had placed the note. Her eyes flickered just for a moment, then settled on him with a calm that unsettled him more than anger ever could. She didn't deny it. She simply answered softly, almost like a whisper. I thought you should remember. The words landed heavier than the note itself. Remember. He leaned forward, lowering his voice further, warning her that such behavior could cost her job, that it was reckless, inappropriate. She stood tall, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and did not waver. The confrontation remained invisible to the others, but to him it felt like the whole restaurant was watching. The note had named the factory by town, by year, and his chest tightened as he recalled it. He saw again the day he had signed the closure order. Hundreds of workers had lost their jobs overnight. It had been hailed as a bold move in the financial press, praised as decisive leadership. The company's profits had soared, his reputation had grown, and he had never looked back. But she brought the past crashing into the present with unflinching precision. That town had withered after the factory closed. Stores shuttered, homes foreclosed, families scattered, and among those families, hers. She didn't say it at first, but her eyes carried the weight of years lived in the shadow of that decision. When he pressed her again, when he demanded to know what she meant by writing such a thing, she finally gave him the truth in fragments. Her father had worked there for decades. He had believed in the company, believed his job was secure. But when the gates closed, their life unraveled. Savings drained, debts mounted, opportunities vanished. Her family had been left behind while he, the man sitting in front of her, had risen higher than ever. He tried to gather himself, tried to respond with the polished arguments that had silenced countless critics. He said it had been necessary, that it was about saving the company, about keeping shareholders from pulling out, about avoiding a collapse that would have cost even more jobs. His words sounded strong, but in this quiet corner, across from a waitress who refused to flinch, they rang hollow. She listened without interruption, then answered simply. It wasn't just numbers. It was people. For the first time in his life, her refusal to yield, to be impressed, to be intimidated, shook him. He had faced senators, billionaires, journalists, and always won. But this woman, standing in her uniform with a tray balanced lightly in one hand, forced him into silence. The manager noticed the tension, drifting near with a cautious glance. The CEO straightened, ready to brush it all aside, but the waitress spoke first, assuring everything was fine. Her tone was professional, calm, dismissing any suspicion. To the manager, it was nothing more than a conversation between a guest and a server. But beneath the surface, a storm was unfolding. When the manager stepped away, the CEO tried again, this time with the quiet force of someone used to control. He told her she was out of line, that she had no right. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood her ground, telling him she wasn't here to embarrass him, wasn't here for money, wasn't even here for revenge. She only wanted him to hear what no one else would say to his face. The steak lay untouched on the table, its aroma fading as his appetite dissolved. For years he had dined in the finest restaurants, savoring meals after victories, celebrating deals, always in command. Tonight he sat in silence, his fork unused, his mind racing. He looked at her again, at the calm strength in her stance, and realized he couldn't shake her words. Finally he leaned forward, his voice tight, almost a whisper, and asked the question that pressed against his chest. Why now? Why tonight? She met his eyes without hesitation, her voice steady and sharp in its simplicity. Because you need to hear what no one else will tell you. She moved between tables with the ease of someone who had done this work for years, her hands carrying plates and glasses, her voice offering polite greetings. But each time she returned to his corner, another fragment of her story slipped through. It wasn't delivered like a speech, not even like a confrontation. It was pieces of a life laid bare in the rhythm of service, the kind of truths that could not be rehearsed. She told him of a factory town that had once thrived, a place where families believed in the steady rhythm of paychecks and the promise of security. Her father had been one of those men, proud, disciplined, loyal. He had given decades to the company, showing up before sunrise, leaving after dark, wearing the same uniformed pride year after year. And then, one day, without warning, the gates closed. There had been no chance to prepare, no chance to find another path. Overnight, the work that sustained entire households vanished, and the man who had promised his children that their future was stable returned home, broken. She placed a fresh glass of water on his table as she spoke, her tone measured, her face calm, but her words carried the weight of years. The family had lost their savings first, then their home. They moved into a cramped apartment, taking whatever work they could. She remembered her mother counting coins at the kitchen table, stretching groceries until there was nothing left to stretch. She remembered her father's silence most of all, the way he sat staring at his hands, calloused and worn, knowing they no longer had purpose. It wasn't just the loss of income. It was the loss of dignity, the collapse of a man who had built his life on loyalty only to be discarded by a decision made in a room he would never see. The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his chair, swirling the untouched wine in his glass as if it could shield him from the story unfolding in front of him. He tried to interrupt, to remind her that it had been necessary, that his hand had been forced, that the numbers had demanded action. If the factory hadn't been closed, the whole company would have gone under, costing even more jobs. He repeated the line he had given the press, the one he had believed enough times to sound convincing. It was just business. But she met his eyes without flinching and countered with quiet certainty. It was people. The words cut through him sharper than accusation. He opened his mouth again, but no explanation sounded strong enough against the reality she described. She cleared another table, returned with bread, and in those pauses her life unfolded further. She explained how she had worked her way through school while helping raise her younger siblings, holding down jobs no teenager should have had to carry. When others her age were enjoying freedom, she was exhausted, worried about bills, worried about whether her family would eat. And now, even as she smiled at strangers and carried trays with grace, she was working double shifts, saving for nursing school, determined to carve a future despite the shadows left behind by that decision. Years ago, he tried once more to reach for the only tool he knew: money. He told her he could help, that if she wanted, he could make her life easier, pay her tuition, erase her struggles with a gesture. But her response was firm, and it left him stunned. This isn't about money. It's about you understanding that power has consequences. The line held him frozen. He had silenced rivals with wealth, soothed critics with donations, and redirected outrage with charity. But none of that mattered here. She didn't want his resources. She wanted his recognition. She wanted him to see, to truly see, that the choices he called business rippled outward into families, into futures, into people like her. For the first time in his life, his authority failed him. He could not intimidate her. He could not buy her silence. He could not dismiss her with corporate logic. She stood in front of him as both server and witness, and he found himself stripped of defenses. The silence between them grew heavier than the clatter of silverware, heavier than the music drifting through the room. He sat back, the weight of his own past pressing into him, forced into stillness, forced into listening. The narrator lingers on the contrast. A billionaire, accustomed to bending worlds to his will, now held motionless by a waitress who refused to let him forget. He lifted his glass finally, not to drink, but to anchor his shaking hand. He looked at her across the table, at the strength in her composure, and for the first time, his voice faltered. It slipped out, raw and unguarded, the question he never thought he would have to ask. "What do you want from me?" Her answer was so simple that it unsettled him more than any demand could have. She didn't ask for money, or favors, or opportunities. She didn't ask for revenge or apology. She just said the words that lingered in the air like a weight he could not push aside. "I want you to remember us, to use your power differently. Don't let other families go through what mine did." For a man used to bargaining, to contracts, to negotiations where everything had a price, there was nothing to trade here, nothing to calculate, nothing to win. It was truth, raw and undeniable, placed in front of him like a mirror he had spent his whole life avoiding. The silence stretched between them. He could hear the soft clink of glassware, the faint music drifting from the piano, the murmur of distant conversation. But around their table the air was heavy. He stared at her, trying to summon the armor he always wore in public, but it cracked under her steady gaze. Pride clashed against conscience, wealth against humanity, and for the first time he realized how hollow his defenses sounded outside the walls of boardrooms. She didn't need statistics. She didn't need explanations. She was the living evidence of the ripples his decisions had left behind. He lowered his eyes, the note still crumpled in his hand. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had delivered countless speeches in his life, crafted lines that moved markets and inspired shareholders, but here he found nothing. No script, no power, just the truth that he had been confronted by someone no one else in his world would have dared to confront. Slowly, he pushed his plate away, appetite gone, the steak untouched. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a stack of bills, not as an insult, not as a way to silence her, but as a gesture of acknowledgement. He left it beneath the check folder, not with the arrogance of a man proving his wealth, but with the quiet respect of someone who finally understood that money was not the answer. When he rose from the table, she did not move to stop him. She only gave a polite nod, the same she might offer to any customer, and stepped back into the rhythm of her work. He walked out into the night air, the city lights stretching endlessly before him, his driver waiting with the door open. But he didn't get in immediately. Instead, he sat on the edge of the leather seat, staring at the skyline. The note was still in his hand, folded and refolded until the creases had deepened. He thought of all the years spent in polished rooms, where lives were reduced to numbers on a chart, where people existed as statistics, where decisions were measured only by profit. And then he thought of faces he had never seen, workers behind machines, children behind windows, families behind, closed doors when the paycheck stopped coming. For the first time, he wondered how many others had been left in silence. The days that followed were restless. He carried the note with him, tucked in his briefcase, and it seemed to stare at him during every meeting. When his executives pitched expansion plans, he thought of the waitress's eyes. When they showed profit margins, he thought of her father's silence at the kitchen table. Something had shifted, something he could not shake, and finally, he acted. The narrator's voice carries the reveal. The billionaire who once prided himself on ruthless efficiency announced a new initiative. His company would reinvest in communities. Training programs were reopened. Local projects were funded. Whole towns that had been left behind by past decisions began receiving resources and opportunities. It was not charity, not a handout. It was a conscious turn, a recognition that power could build instead of destroy. She never heard from him personally again. To her, he remained only the man who once sat at her table, rattled by a note. But weeks later, on her break, she scrolled through the news on her phone and saw the headlines. Articles described the company's dramatic shift, praised the CEO's surprising change of heart, speculated on what had caused it. She read in silence, and then, just faintly, a small smile touched her lips. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, because the years of struggle could not be undone. But it was something else. Relief, perhaps, or a quiet pride that her voice, once unheard, had finally carried weight. The narrator lingers on the reflection. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the heaviest truths. Sometimes a folded piece of paper delivered by hands that the powerful overlook can shake an empire. A note that reminded a man who thought himself untouchable that power is nothing without responsibility, nothing without humanity. The billionaire's empire would continue, his wealth would remain, but something inside him had been altered forever. And as the story closes, the narrator leaves one final truth. Power means nothing if it forgets the people who built it.